Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Virtues, a very short introduction, by Craig A. Boyd and Kevin Tempe, narrated by John Mclain. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Chapter 1. Whose virtues? Which vices? Habits, skills, rules, and virtues. The primary aim of this book is to give an overview of virtue, understood as an excellent way of being. Having the virtues shapes the patterns of our behavior. But as this book illustrates, although virtue influences behavior, it cannot be reduced to mere behavior. Virtue involves having certain skills, but it also requires knowing what the point of those skills is, and thus knowing when the excellence of a certain skill might require us to break a rule. In the coming sections, we aim to point out exemplars that model certain excellences. Those exemplars give us guidelines on how we should act. But we also show that becoming virtuous involves knowing what the point of that guideline is, and knowing when slavishly following the rule isn't the best option. Consider the case of the would-be chef who begins by following recipes. The recipe provides rules for how to mix ingredients, how to treat eggs, grains, vegetables, and spices. It provides rules for baking, frying, and grilling. It serves as a prescription or guide for what the beginner should do. But we can also understand the recipe as a description of what the excellent chef does. The young athlete who aspires to play in the World Cup practices every afternoon taking shots, passing the ball, dribbling with both feet, trapping the ball, juggling, agility, etc. She works under the guidance of her coach, who gives her rules for her drills. Strike the ball this way, not that way. Keep your head up. Know where to pass the ball. Do not use your toe. Lean over the ball. Move to open space. These instructions and rules are designed to help the novice player learn the skills necessary to play the game well. To become good at some activity, we need to develop skills specific to that activity. A skill is an acquired ability to perform a specific kind of action in the service of some particular purpose. Baking is a skill a chef employs in the service of eating and in the further service of maintaining one's health or the enjoyment of eating good food with others. Passing is a skill that an athlete employs in the service of scoring a goal for the further purpose of winning a game. Skills are developed by repetition and by following the rules that govern their acquisition. But true excellence is when the skills are internalized and people don't have to mindlessly follow rules or even explicitly consult them. Experts are people who have internalized the principles of good cooking or good football through years of experience so that they now naturally do these things without explicitly consulting the recipes or the rules. The excellent athlete, like the expert chef, knows what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. They are the people who know that when the rules apply and when they do not cannot be determined by yet another rule. The expert is the person for whom the principles have become a second nature. They have so internalized what the rules aim at that following them, or knowing when in fact to break them, comes to them naturally. In a similar way to a recipe or instructions from a coach, a moral rule is a description or an approximation of what a morally excellent person does that simultaneously functions as a prescription for the novice. The limitations on recipes and rules are that they simply provide guidelines from the perspective of the individual who has not internalized them. Rules may tell us what to do, but they don't tell us how to be. One important moral habit is honesty. Parents might have rules that their children always tell the truth. Very young children often come to follow the rules as required by the parents. A child might not know why the truth-telling rule applies, but she might follow it as it is possible her life might depend on it. The rule can function to help the young child, and as she grows, she comes to see why the rule applies. But as the child grows, her parents want her to not only understand the value of telling the truth, but also to internalize honesty as a valuable character trait. Like excellent chefs or excellent footballers, morally virtuous people do not slavishly follow rules. Moral virtues go much deeper than providing rules for behavior and descriptions. Morally good people internalize principles of good behavior, like truth-telling, so that their actions provide a model or exemplar for what people should do. That is, honesty can be viewed as a virtue and not simply as a rule, and we can look to honest people as exemplars for our own behavior. But what is it about honesty that makes it a virtue? To know how to answer that question, we first have to know the answer to a previous question. What does it mean to be a virtue? The consensus across cultures and traditions seems to be that a virtue is an excellent and stable quality of the soul that enables a person to act well regarding some kind of activity. That is, virtues are good habits. For a quality to be a virtue, it needs to persist over time. A one-off action is not a virtue, since it is an isolated instance. As Aristotle observes, one swallow does not make a spring. But a virtue cannot be just any quality, but an excellent quality. But what do we mean by the phrase excellent quality? In one sense, it means that the quality helps a person acquire some excellent end, like truth-telling or right thinking. But it can also mean that it makes its possessor excellent. In this second sense, a virtue promotes the growth and maturity of its possessor, and it will enable its possessor to practice the activity with relative ease and pleasure. Thus, any serious study of the virtues will attend not only to what the virtues are, but how we acquire them. Although many people rightly understand virtue in terms of moral qualities, the scope of the term is wider than that. There are also intellectual and productive virtues. A chef possesses a kind of productive habit, but a scientist possesses an intellectual habit. When we possess these habits in an excellent manner, we call them virtues. These cooking and experimental qualities are not, however, moral. The more typical way we understand a virtue is with regard to moral virtue, in the sense that it makes its possessor morally good, and it aims at morally good ends or activities. Just as there are characteristics that are marks of intellectual or moral excellence, there are also characteristics that are marks of moral failure, such as dispositions to dishonesty, injustice, arrogance, and greed. These dispositions to behave badly are the vices. We can see that the criteria for what constitutes a vice correspond in important ways to those of virtue. A vice, then, is a stable but harmful quality of the soul that prevents a person from acting or living well. Like the virtues, the vices are qualities that endure over time. We expect liars to lie habitually and with relative ease. The habit becomes so ingrained that they often do so as a second nature. But lying, like other vices, tends to frustrate real goods we long to possess, like community, friendship, and trust. For a quality to be a vice, it typically frustrates the ends for which an agent aims, or it actively harms the agent. But to understand how vices and virtues operate, they need to be seen contextually. Like the broad range of cuisine people might encounter in their travels, the virtues are socially and culturally situated with expert practitioners of their own. Some of the characteristics of virtuous people will vary with place, locale, and historical time frame. But that doesn't mean there aren't such things as human excellences any more than the difference between gelati and pie mean there's no such thing as an excellent dessert. Modesty, for example, might function differently for a Japanese schoolchild, where silence and deference to one's elders take precedence, than it does for an English real estate agent, where a certain amount of confidence and extroversion are critical to their success. But this raises an important problem in our consideration of the virtues. Are these qualities so diverse that they really share nothing in common? That is, doesn't relativism pose a problem for any account of the virtues? Although there are individual, social, biological, psychological, and religious differences among people and their practices, it does not follow that there are no common cross-cultural elements. Theologians and philosophers, like Thomas Aquinas and C.S. Lewis, insisted on a shared human nature and basic moral principles, for example, honoring one's parents, practicing justice, cultivating wisdom, that were essentially the same throughout the world. More recently, positive psychologists in their empirical research have identified the high six virtues: courage, justice, humanity, temperance, transcendence, and wisdom that exist in all cultures throughout the world and over time. Even though the virtues might differ in their expression from one culture to another, they have a coherent resemblance to one another. The reason for this is that values like honesty and compassion are the elements without which no society can function. It may be, as the positive psychologists argue, that we are grounded in biology through an evolutionary process that selected for these aspects of excellence as means of solving the important tasks necessary for the survival of the species. The upshot of this points to a human nature that both the Japanese schoolchild and the English real estate agent share, but one that will also manifest itself differently given unique social and cultural locations. So despite the variation, the virtues can be understood as creating and describing an ideal account of what it means to be a morally good person in diverse cultures, religions, and philosophical traditions. An important quality differentiates athletic and artistic qualities from moral virtues. Lionel Messi or Julia Child may or may not be morally good human beings. A person can be a great athlete or a great chef. In other words, they may possess excellent skills essential to the practice of their profession, while also being a morally depraved human being. Conversely, a virtuous person might have no artistic or athletic abilities or skills. What we see, then, is that there may be an analogous way of acquiring skills, character traits, abilities, and virtues, but the nature of these qualities differs radically. A moral virtue, in the words of philosopher Robert Adams, is an excellence in being for the good. And this good is not merely the athletic or culinary good, but the moral good. Orienting oneself towards the good requires that we stop any harmful habits and begin the cultivation of a new set of excellent habits. Ignatius Loyola, 1491 to 1556, was a mid-career soldier in northern Spain who had a life-altering experience. He was an excellent soldier, and he had seen himself as a stylish, handsome man. And by his own admission, he was a person who was excessively concerned with making a good impression in the courts of the local Spanish nobility. But in a battle in Pamplona in 1521, a cannonball crashed through the castle wall he was defending and broke his leg. The doctors set the leg incorrectly. It had to be reset more than once, and at one point some of the bone had to be sawn off. While he was convalescing at home, he wanted to read some books about knights and their heroic deeds. But none could be found, so he settled for books on the life of Christ and the saints. The more he read, the more he was intrigued, and thought to himself, I could become a saint, and I should become one if I can. So he began a long process of character transformation from a narcissistic soldier to the altruistic saint who founded homes for prostitutes, schools for the poor, and missions for the sick. By the end of his life, he had cultivated habits of compassion, self-discipline, humility, and perseverance. The discipline necessary to becoming a good soldier was analogous to those disciplines necessary to becoming a good person. A helpful way to think of Ignatius' virtues, and indeed the virtues in general, is to consider them as a second nature. Just as we all possess a given nature by our genes, we can also acquire a second nature in terms of our personal qualities, dispositions, and behaviors. No one is born with an ability to speak Italian or play the cello, or to practice self-discipline, or to act justly. But given the relative psychological and physical malleability of human nature, most people can acquire them. A person acquires these abilities over time, with practice, and under the supervision of someone who already knows the language or the instrument. In time, a person can converse in Rome or play a Mozart quartet with relative ease. So, too, the person who practices self-control over her desires for, say, coffee, follows a similar pattern. Suppose the person thinks it's best to not drink more than an entire pot in the morning. At first, it's hard for them to resist. They love the taste of coffee, and they're used to it. But the more they cut back on their intake, the easier it becomes to resist the desire to overly caffeinate. Furthermore, having others to help encourage them and hold them accountable will increase their chance of success. If they practice self-control long enough, they may find not only that their behavior has changed, but that it is now natural for them to do this in their revised morning routine. These acquired patterns of behavior lead us to expect people to behave in predictable ways. But more importantly for virtue, the internalization of the pattern changes persons themselves. A virtuous person enjoys doing virtuous things and experiences a kind of moral disgust in the thought or performance of a vicious act. As the chef finds the poorly made dish disgusting, so the virtuous person finds the immoral act repulsive. Like virtuous people, vicious people also behave in predictable ways. However, the vicious person pursues the goods of food, drink, sex, status, excellence, and property in inappropriate ways. A vice is a habitual disposition to act in ways contrary to what the good person would think, do, and feel. For example, wrath runs contrary to the patient, thoughtful, compassionate concern of the virtuous person by a habitual surrender to violent and uncontrolled outbursts of anger. Moreover, the vicious person enjoys what she does. Instead of experiencing sorrow or disgust at engaging in bad behavior, the truly vicious person enjoys it. The wrathful person feels justified and satisfied in the expression of their anger. But just as there are different lists of the virtues, so too there are different lists of the vices. Since the vices are opposed to virtues, we should expect this. What one thinks is vicious depends on what one thinks is virtuous. A fairly standard list of the vices emerged in the early era of Christianity and still resonates with many philosophers, psychologists, and theologians. Among the lists of vices, 7 are understood as capital, from the Latin caput, for head. This list includes pride, envy, avarice, wrath, sloth, lust, and gluttony. These vices are all ways in which people pursue the various goods appropriate to human beings in ways that are harmful to themselves and others. Each is an improper orientation toward a good that a virtue aims at. They are dispositions to behave in predictable ways with the accompanying effective responses. The proud person enjoys looking down on others. The wrathful person takes pleasure in recklessly venting her anger. And the slothful person enjoys avoiding the demands his relationships require of him. Many of the virtues, therefore, can be understood not only as those dispositions that help us to resist the lure of the vices, but also as ways of developing healthy attitudes towards our desires. A virtue, then, is not merely an acquired ability to act in any predictable way, but one that helps us pursue the good in the right way and with the appropriate affective dispositions. The fully virtuous person takes proper delight in the exercise of the virtues. For those of us who do not find virtuous activity delightful, This reflects the fact that we are not complete in virtue. Consider what it means to be a gracious person. At the end of the year, your workplace gives awards to various employees. The gracious person, as distinguished from the polite person, not only offers congratulations to those who get the awards, but she also does it in a predictable way with kind words. Yet there is also another hidden quality, this effective disposition of gladness for the other person, which the polite but not gracious person does not have. Buddhists call the effective disposition to delight in the other person's good fortune mudita. The truly gracious person, the person who has mudita, not only does the right things, but also feels the right emotions in the practice of virtue. A short history of thinking about the virtues. Although we can trace the origins of the virtues back in the West to Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, we can also find them in the various religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, among others. A common theme is that they all appealed to the idea that people should develop stable dispositions that assist them in pursuit of a good life. The virtues receive the greatest attention from philosophers in the thought of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. The locus classicus for the virtues is in Aristotle's 384 to 322 BCE Nicomachean Ethics, which is a compilation of student notes from his lectures. It lacks the polished quality of a finished treatise, but nevertheless provides reference points for how we still think about the virtues. Of particular importance are his definition of virtue and the role of virtue in human flourishing. Aristotle defined virtues as certain kinds of human excellences that help us to live, think, and do well. There are, then, three broad categories of virtues that he lays out for his readers: moral virtues, which help us live well; intellectual virtues, which help us think well; and practical virtues, which help us make things well. The artisan who cooks well has the practical virtue of art, where art refers to anything a person can produce well, ranging from cooking and painting to architecture and poetry. Art is an excellence a person possesses that enables him to take various raw materials and transform them into something new. The excellent abilities of the artist imbue the artifact with an excellence the novice does not have. A Picasso or a Julia Child possess the virtue of art in ways that others do not. Art, therefore, is a kind of knowing how to make things. Since we also are creatures who not only need to make things well, we also need to think well. That is, we need virtues of the mind, or intellectual virtues. These virtues of the mind facilitate everything from daily decisions about whether a politician's statements are truthful or not, to the practices of scientists in their laboratories about how to test a specific compound. But these excellences are not strictly moral qualities. There are those who are great thinkers, but who also possess bad character. In order to flourish, we need to not only be able to make things well and to think well, we need to be able to act well. And it is this acting well which is the domain of moral virtues and leads to human flourishing. The moral virtues, on Aristotle's account, played the central role in a life of flourishing. The Greek word Aristotle uses for flourishing is eudaimonia, but it has often, unfortunately, been translated into English as happiness, which is a notoriously slippery word whose meaning can range from an emotional state of contentment to something much more robust. Rather, flourishing indicates an overall and fairly constant sense of well-being. The moral virtues enable us to control and shape our appetites so that we are not merely subject to the whims of unrestrained desires. Reflection shows us that unbridled desire does not lead to a flourishing life. The greedy person does not flourish. Her life isn't going well as a whole because she is incapable of controlling her insatiable desire for ever-increasing amounts of wealth. Aristotle would say she cannot flourish precisely because she lacks virtue. A good person not only needs to be able to think well about her actions, she also needs to be able to control her appetites and act with courage based on what she knows. Courage, as one of the moral virtues, helps to show how the moral virtues require a kind of consistent overcoming of various desires that might lead us to choose the easy course of action, rather than the more difficult route that leads to a life well lived. Aristotle's teacher, Plato, 429 to 347 BCE, also addressed the virtues, most notably in his work, Republic, where he sees justice, wisdom, courage, and self-control applying to both the human soul and the state itself. For Plato, we could divide the soul into mind, a spirited element, and the appetites. Wisdom was the virtue of the mind, courage of the spirited element, and self-control of the appetites. For Plato, justice had a kind of priority and applied to the overall harmony of one's soul. That is, when wisdom, with the assistance of courage, ruled the appetites. Like Plato, Cicero, 106 to 43 BCE, the great Roman statesman, saw the virtues as central to the life of civic responsibility. Without the virtues, neither the person nor the state could flourish. For him, all morally right action springs from 4 particular virtues: prudence, justice, courage, and self-control, which have come to be called the cardinal virtues. In Latin, cardo means hinge, or that on which a thing turns. And so the cardinal virtues are often seen as the main virtues that both individuals and states need to flourish. Other virtues can be seen as further specifications of these 4. As Cicero describes the cardinal virtues, prudence is the full perception and intelligent development of the true. Justice preserves society itself by rendering to everyone what is their due. Courage is the strength of a noble and invincible spirit, and temperance is the orderliness and moderation of everything that is said and done. Augustine, 354 to 430, inherited Plato's understanding of the virtues as mediated through Cicero. In his early work, Augustine praised the 4 cardinal virtues, and then later wrote on the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which could only be acquired by divine grace. In his most mature work, The City of God, he sees the cardinal virtues as fundamentally flawed unless they are corrected and reoriented to God by the theological virtues. He says, "For although some suppose that virtues which have a reference only to themselves and are desired only on their own account are yet true and genuine virtues, the fact is that even then they are inflated with pride, and are therefore to be reckoned vices rather than virtues. Pagan virtues, even those that facilitate peaceful coexistence and social harmony, don't have their orientation in God, and thus, in his view, are not genuine virtues." Thomas Aquinas, 1224-73, inherited the philosophical tradition of Aristotle through Islamic thinkers like Ibn Rushd, 1126-98, Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, 1138-1204, and other Christian thinkers like Albert the Great, 1200-80. But looming behind all these was the figure of Augustine and his interpretation of the Christian faith. Standing in the Christian world of Augustine and the philosophical world of Aristotle, Aquinas attempted to incorporate the Aristotelian account of the virtues into a wider theistic understanding of the moral life. He characterizes the virtues not only as good for living a well-ordered life here and now with regard to thoughtful and peaceful coexistence with others, but also in terms of an explicit appeal to God. He says, "Virtue is a good quality of the soul, by which we live rightly, of which no one can make bad use, which God works in us, without us." Like Aristotle, he sees virtue as a good quality of the soul that makes both the person and her action good. but he also sees it as having its ultimate origin in God. The Good Samaritan.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?